My name is Pat Langston, and we are here with our Lipscomb Legends series. Today we are with Dr. Robert Hooper, who was the chairman of the history department here for
30 years.
30 years. Welcome, Dr. Hooper. Good to have you. And I'd like to start by asking you to tell us about your early life, maybe your childhood, your family.
It's really interesting because, of course, I'm a Depression baby. I was born in 1932, and that was the lowest birth rate up to that time in the history of the United States.
Really?
1932. So I was kind of lucky to be here. My dad worked at DuPont in Oak Hickory, making, well, almost nothing. But the DuPont people did keep all of their workers on, which helped, you know. And so, to make a long story short, I grew up in Old Hickory, and then when I was just a youngster, we wanted to get out of the big city, so we moved to Neely's Bend, out in the country, and that's when I first started at school, to Neely's Bend Elementary School there, and then I went to, I think, 6th grade, I think that's right, to Stratton High School in Madison. We'd moved to Madison by that time, moved up. And, but my dad then was transferred to they called it Pasco, Washington, but it turned out to be the new town of Richland, Washington, which was totally constructed by the government for workers at the Hanford Engineering Works.
Really?
And that turned out to be one of the sister cities to Oak Ridge, where they made the stuff to go into the atomic bomb, nuclear bomb. My dad had no idea what he was doing.
Really?
All he did was to make sure that whatever was behind that wall, that he kept it cool by the water, you know, coming out of the Columbia River. So that's all he did. He didn't know what he was doing. And it so happened that I was in scout camp in the Wallowa Mountains in northeastern Oregon the day after, I guess, the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
Wow.
And it was only then that we found out what my dad had been doing at Hanford.
Amazing.
And so, so we were, but Washington for me, now for my brother it was, he liked that, but I never lost my love for Tennessee. And so my parents even subscribed to the Tennessean for me, and it would come, you know, several days late, but that was, I'd read the Tennessean. And then for the time to go to school, we visited Abilene Christian. I had an uncle who was teaching there, and that summer was the hottest summer I think they'd ever had. They were even this was for publicity, they put big chunks of ice in their swimming pools to keep them cool, you know, things like that. But then we came on to Nashville, and Lipscomb's campus was green and beautiful and new, so I knew this is where I was going to school.
Okay.
And so in 1950, I came to Lipscomb from Richland, Washington, with about two other of my friends that came with me, and we traveled by train all the way to Nashville. And
now, these two friends, were they lifelong residents of Washington?
Well, no, they were like me. You know, they were people who moved there.
Okay. And you just convinced them to come with
you?
you?
And they were part of the Church of Christ there in Richland. And it was for a fair-sized church for the Northwest. I guess there are 200 people in the church, because most of them are transferred from the South, you know, and so we came back here, and I was the only one that stayed the full time.
Okay.
And I graduated in 1954 with a history major, and we'll talk about some of those people.
Okay, I wanted to ask you regarding the history. Did you come here to study history?
Well, you know, I'm not sure.
So
But history was always of interest to me. I can remember when I was just a youngster, going through, I guess maybe we had it in school, a book, but that had, and I can remember exactly what it was about. It was a chapter on the Belgian Congo. Now, I don't know why I remember that, but it was there, you know, and I was impressed, and I was always enjoyed reading. I would read historical novels and when I was a youngster. And so history just kind of came to me. Now, math, no.
Okay.
No. I gave up on math about my junior year in high school. That wasn't worth me sticking there. So the other side of my brain was filled with history. So that's where I ended up. But I came here and changed majors a couple of times. I knew that I wanted to preach a little bit. Thought I might maybe be a full-time preacher. And I think I could have been. But in the long run, that did not really stick with me. Some reason, got interested in teaching. Now, how? It's hard to say because, and so I graduated in 1954. Now, within that framework, I changed majors at least once or twice because I started, maybe started as a history major, switched to speech because that's where Lipscomb was the strongest then.
Okay.
It had Batsell Baxter, Carol Ellis, and Harold Baker. I mean, it was our strongest department. Lipscomb put people into graduate school everywhere out of that speech department. But I got into phonetics, and that turned me off. I wasn't interested in phonetics, and so I decided I'll go back to history. And by that time, I had taken up a liking to S.C. Boyce.
And that was one of your teachers?
One of my teachers.
I wanted to ask you about that. I
Yeah.
mean, who were the people?
Well, and so but then the person who really made the difference in my taking up history was Howard White,
Okay.
who was probably still the best history teacher I have ever had.
What made him a great history teacher?
He was excited about history,
Okay.
and he could teach it without really looking at too many notes, and he had his degree from Tulane University, but was a great teacher. And if anything, that probably impacted me to go into teaching more than anything else. Okay. But S.C. Boyce was one of the finest men who'd ever lived. He, in fact, his son was Fesser Boyce.
Yes, I know him.
Okay. Which was one of my closest friends as a student and then coming back as a faculty. But S.C. Boyce literally gave his time to teach history at Lipscomb. He worked at the post office at night.
Wow.
Elder over here at the Granny White Church. And then he would come and teach history during the daytime.
That's amazing.
Now, great teacher? No, he was not a great teacher. When he would teach, he would sit a lot and prop a textbook up in front of him and, go by the text. But the man was, if I've ever known a Christian man, he was it. And he would oftentimes illustrate history by spiritual things. And he was an unusual man. I'll just tell you something about him. He had, and Fesser had this same quality, this same thing. When he started thinking about something that he wanted to talk about, he'd put his finger right here. And you knew that you're about to get something that was meaningful from his own spiritual background. And he wrote a little book called Power to Become, which fits all this. But he would then do this and stare out the window and be quiet for a few seconds. And then he'd turn around and then tell you something. And one I remember, it's only when people begin to hurt do they begin to bless. That stayed with me. And so he was one of those unusual person. And he had a habit, like some people and so forth. He would get in there and he would say, in there. That was his kind of erring, in there.
So you decided when you came to Lipscomb, you would major in history, even though you switched a couple of times. Once you got into the history department and started studying that, did you know that you wanted to teach?
You know, it's hard to say, but I think so, because my first few years, in fact, until 1979, I not only taught, but I also preached, with exception of, well, no, the whole time, because I preached while I was in school. The best place I preached was the old Lucia Church down in, I guess it's Marshall County. Church that goes back to 1832.
Wow.
And at that time I wasn't, you know, I'd gotten a little interested in restoration history because Dr. Carol Ellis taught restoration preaching. And that was the only course we had in restoration history at all at Lipscomb then. And so I got interested in that and read the sermons of some of the pioneers and this kind of stuff. And so that got me interested in that field. And somewhere along the way, though, I decided I wanted to teach because I went to Peabody and got my master's in history, but it was a teaching. I got my teaching certificate while I was over there. And then I finished my degree at Peabody, and I was preaching at Unionville, down around Chevrolet at that time. And it so happened that the Elys attended there, and their daughter was the wife of Ralph Snell, who was connected with the Mars Hill Bible School in Florence, Alabama. Yeah. And so they told me to get in contact, well, that he would have Ralph Snell to get in contact with me, and he did. And in fact, he hired both of us. Had gotten married in '54, so we'll get back to that in a minute. And so Virginia was hired to be an elementary school teacher, and I was hired to be a Bible teacher and a history teacher.
At Mars Hill Academy?
At Mars Hill Academy in Florence, Alabama. And and again, one of those things that I appreciated even more later than then, but the main classroom building was T.B. Larimore's home.
Amazing.
And I taught in the upstairs back bedroom of the classroom. So that's how I got into teaching.
Wondering maybe who'd slept there.
Well, maybe in T.B. Larimore,
yeah.
You know. So I got interested in Larimore, and of course, being at Lipscomb, I got interested in the man Lipscomb, so this is beginning to be what I would emphasize the rest of my life.
Right. So going back to Mars Hill, how long were you there, you and your wife?
3 years altogether.
Okay.
I was there 2 years, and then I decided, I don't know how much Virginia decided, but she was willing, you know, she was to go to Columbia Christian College in Portland, Oregon, going back out west. I thought that was my calling, to go back out to the Northwest. I found out it wasn't. So, in fact, the 2 years I spent there were the 2 worst years I've ever experienced in my professional career. They're horrible.
It's interesting that you say that, because Dr. Hazlett, just before you, a little while ago, was saying you can't go home again.
Yeah, but you can. But you can. We went back to Mars Hill for 1 year, and then an opening came in the history department at Lipscomb.
Did they contact you?
No, I contacted them, and one other fellow had turned the job down, and he took a job in Washington, D.C., and in fact, has taught part-time at Lipscomb in our department since he retired from his job with intelligence in Washington, D.C. But he turned it down, and I was standing in line. And so...
And you're grateful.
Oh, grateful, because it began a long career for me. So we're actually getting ahead of ourselves, I guess.
Who were some of your classmates when you were at Lipscomb that have still been around Lipscomb for a number of years?
Well, see, there's nobody my age around anymore. See, I'm 80.
Dr. Hazelwood.
Yeah, but
He was a little ahead of you.
he
in
was ahead of.
school.
See, he's only 2 years ahead of me, age-wise, but he was about 3 or 4 years ahead of me.
Okay.
Because I think he went to college at age 16 or 17. You
One
know.
of those prodigies.
Oh, he was.
Yeah.
He was, and so he finished Lipscomb, I think, in '51. I don't maybe something like that.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly.
Yeah. But anyway, so I'm just trying to think. See, Ralph Nance was one, Betty Nance, who's still alive, but most of those that I was around have passed on.
Okay.
And I'm both at church at Woodmont Hills and at Lipscomb. I am a loner now.
Oh. Okay.
So it's just that it happens.
Yeah. I guess if you live long enough.
Yeah, it does.
Right.
No, there's one person at Woodmont that's older than me, and he fought and he flew fighter pilots in World War II, so he's lucky to even be around. But he's 92, I think, and still going.
Well, you still have an association with Lipscomb, though.
Oh,
you
my.
still
Oh.
teach from time to time.
Well, let's see. I've taught every year in the fall. In fact, after I retired in '98, I taught full time as an adjunct for 2 or 3 years until I met a young lady. I'll tell you about her later. But then we would come back to Nashville, Franklin, every fall in August and stay full time until Christmas, where I would teach 1 course or 2 courses in the fall. And I missed one when I was working on a manuscript that is now a new book, and so this fall I decided not to teach because I was having knee surgery on July the 24th, and so that automatically knocked that out. But I'm probably hanging it up. This is probably
Really?
it. 55 years.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
Who knows? Who knows? Who knows?
Well, while you were teaching here at Lipscomb regularly, who were some of your very close colleagues here?
You talking about teachers now?
Yeah, teachers.
Okay. Well, I tell you the ones that made an impression on me. You know, we talked about S.C. Boyce and Howard White. But this may sound strange to you. 2 women, and really there are 3 women who were teachers of mine that were quite unusual. One of them taught English, and I had her in freshman English, Jenny Pitty Brown. She was a little short woman, lived out in the Pasco area, and taught English, freshman English, and I don't know whatever else, but I had her in freshman English. And she had her peculiar ways of teaching. And she called roll every day. And you had to answer her whether or not you were prepared or unprepared.
That's how you had to answer?
That's how you had to answer. Were you prepared or unprepared for today's lesson?
Oh, my.
So that put pressure on you, you know. Most people didn't like her, and I didn't like her all that much then either, but, you know, I've appreciated her since. And so she was a very unusual person, but very Southern. Her Southern speech and everything, you know, kind of the Southern aristocracy speech. I mean, she was really there. And then 2 other women, and I was just looking at the Lipscomb centennial history this morning, and one of those women came to Lipscomb to teach in 1919, and she was still teaching in the 1950s. And this was Miss Ora Crabtree. You ever heard of her?
I have not.
Oh, you heard of her. She taught speech and expression. Now that's how they referred to, you know, back then was expression. And she taught all the preachers how to read. You know, with
the text.
Yes, with feeling. You know, not only the Bible, but we read lots of different kinds of things. And she used as one of her textbooks, and I still have a copy of it, that was authored by her professor in Boston by the name of Curry. And it was the title was expression of some sort. And so we learned to read and how to read with feeling and how people can understand what you read. And what little ability I have of reading publicly, I got that from her. But she was a teacher of expression and speech and director of drama, and she had some major dramas before I got there in the 30s and early 40s, where they would go out in front of Sewell Hall and put up a stage there.
Really?
Faculty members, students, all would be a part of the cast, and they would have huge crowds for those plays.
Never heard that.
Oh yeah, so she was something else, and I think that what we don't appreciate really about her was that the training of preachers and how they should speak was given by a woman. Mm-hmm. Isn't that interesting? And another woman was Irma Lee Beatty.
Now, I have heard of her.
Yeah, Irma Lee Beatty. She was a music teacher, mm-hmm. and she taught the course on song leading for ministers. And so two of the main teachers that preachers had when they were at Lipscomb to become preachers were taught by women.
Quite ironic given the day and time.
Yes. Well, yes, and of course I think it's interesting. And have you ever been in the Hooper Conference Room in Easel?
I've been there.
Okay. If there's a photograph up on the wall of the faculty, I think it's 1916. Half of the faculty are women, which is very unusual. Mm-hmm. Very unusual. And first art teacher that goes way on back was Mrs. Noble. It's just fascinating that Lipscomb, you're a little school in Nashville, Tennessee, a religious school that probably the church emphasizes men, and here are women who are teachers.
Great influence.
Yeah, great influence.
Well, speaking of art, I'm going to change the subject a little bit. One of your dear friends was Dr. Hutchinson.
Oh my! Oh,
could you talk
best
about
friend.
How that developed?
Well, now how did you find out about that?
Somebody told me that recently. Actually, Dr. Good.
Okay.
Richard Good.
Okay. I hired Dr. Good. One of the best hires
Good
ever
hire,
made.
yes.
I
was a student with him.
Oh, were you?
At Lipscomb. He was 2 years behind me.
Yeah. Well, I think he's one of the best teachers on the campus and one of the best hires ever made. And of course, his work that he does with the prison.
Amazing.
Oh, it's amazing work. Mm-hmm. It's amazing work. But anyway, John and I got associated, I guess, because we were down in the first floor of Burton Building, mm-hmm. when the Student Center and everything was down there, bookstore, the whole works. About half the campus, yes. was within that building. And we became good buddies, and we had a lot in common, theologically, even then, when we were, it really did not become good friends until it became part of the faculty. Okay, so I did not know him as a student. I think he was a little ahead of me. But he was the best friend I've ever had. And Marinelle, whenever I see her, she still talks about John and Bob. We talked restoration history. He was interested in that. And so we talked about, Campbell's and Stone's and Lipscomb and, the whole works. And so we were interested both in those kinds of things.
Did the two of you ever collaborate on anything?
No, we didn't.
Okay.
But we talked all the time. In fact, Mary Nell still talks about how that if John didn't show up for dinner and I didn't show up for dinner at the right time, they knew that we were somewhere talking.
Yeah.
And so we were
Well, that's wonderful
closest of friends.
to hear that.
And he died too early.
Yeah.
Because he probably had as much influence on the Lipscomb campus as anybody, because he was involved in so many things.
Mm-hmm. He was well loved.
Well loved. Oh, well loved. Yes, yes, yes.
Well, you've obviously written a number of books. You've made reference to some of that work. You wrote a biography of David Lipscomb.
Yes.
Crying in the Wilderness.
Crying
I
in
think
the
it's been updated even.
Yes, 1911.
Here's what I want to ask you
Okay.
about that. First of all, how did you get interested in that? Maybe just the connection with the school?
No. Of course, that had to do with it because having known something about the man Lipscomb and didn't know much about being a student because it was never talked about. Nobody knew much about him. So when I started doing my dissertation at Peabody, I asked Dr. Allen, my major professor, said, how about me doing something on David Lipscomb? And I didn't know a whole lot about him. I never researched him. But I knew something about his political views.
Mm-hmm.
And so I suggested to him, said, well, if I do a dissertation on Lipscomb's political views and his educational views, would that make a good dissertation? And he said, yes.
Great.
But now Dr. Allen he knocked over every barrier for me to get my degree. I'm very unusual. I started my degree when I came in 1960 on a part-time basis while I was teaching. Go full-time in the summers, and I finished that degree in 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's very unusual,
Mm-hmm.
because when I got to the dissertation, he literally knocked down every barrier. I would take a chapter to him on Friday. On Monday, I could pick it up. He'd read it.
Wow.
And a lot of people getting their PhDs will sit around months before the professor.
Frustrating.
Yes, oh, it is. And so I was able to get my degree. But what this did for me was to introduce me to David Lipscomb, because in researching, I had to go through especially the Gospel Advocate.
Okay.
And I know the Gospel Advocate. Well, there may be one other person, maybe John Mark Hicks knows him as well as I do, although I was there before him. And in fact, I may have introduced him to Restoration history when I gave a lecture in Springfield, Virginia, and he was a 16-year-old, and he came to hear me. I did not know that until just a couple of years ago.
Really?
Yeah. And so I went from the time the Advocate started until all the way through the 20s, and and this is where I found most of my information on Lipscomb, and then other places. And so when I got through, I had a dissertation on his political and educational ideas in 1965.
Right.
But what that did was to set me up for life. That everything else I have researched and written has a connection with Lipscomb.
Wow.
One way or another.
Well, when you wrote your book, did you have access to any primary sources?
Some. There were some Aunt Mag letters that Mrs. Stroop had that I was able to use.
That he had, his personal letters?
No, Aunt Mag's.
Oh, okay.
His wife's personal letters. He evidently he didn't write much, just regular letters. He would answer anybody who had questions for him within the Advocate itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so he would have half a page, sometime a page of responses to letters.
So it was easy to know his views because
Oh
of
yes,
those
oh
kinds
yes,
of
yes, yes,
answers
yes,
that he would
yes,
give.
yes. And of course, so he was, the Advocate was almost his diary, because he would tell his own stories there.
Wow.
It was in the Advocate that I learned about his family and going to Illinois to free slaves.
Wow.
and that's where his mother died. And then later, when his, I guess it was his aunt died, he talked about the loss of a child losing its mother. And I just know, as I read that Lipscomb at the age of 3 or 4 remembered his mother dying of maybe typhoid fever. And so they went there to free their slaves, and they did, but not in Illinois, over in Indiana. And then they all returned to Tennessee because of the loss of life there. So, all of this was in the Advocate. It's just amazing what it's a.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I wanted you to speak to Lipscomb's relationship to Churches of Christ.
Okay. The Lipscomb family came out of a Baptist background. And his parents were made a trip to around Todd County, Kentucky. Oh, I forget, 1928 or so. And where they were visiting with Granville Lipscomb and his wife, were visiting with her sister there and brother-in-law. And they had come in contact with the ideas of Alexander Campbell, and had converted to the views that Campbell advocated. In fact, I think he passed through their community and whatever. And then they, in turn, brought these ideas back to Franklin County, Tennessee, Winchester area, shared them with 2 brothers and their families, and they all converted.
And when was he exposed to Campbell?
1828.
Okay.
And so they came back and then started worshiping outside of the Baptist church. And in fact, probably they were withdrawn from by the Baptist church. And because Lipscomb was rather critical of the preacher for that Baptist church, and his father said, no, you can't, no, that's not right, But they were no longer allowed in the Baptist church. And so they started a church of their own out of the trees and so forth. But that was the beginning of Lipscomb's association with what would become Churches of Christ. Okay. And then his parents sent him to Franklin College, which was Talbert Fanning's school, here up where the airport's located. And and of course, Talbert Fanning was a leader in the Christian church as it was known then, more or less. And so Lipscomb that's where he was baptized, in a watering trough there at Franklin College. And he almost, because of a problem within the church here in Nashville, Lipscomb almost gave up. Going back to the Baptist, studied it, decided no, he was on the right track. Not a preacher, not much of a preacher, although he preached quite a bit, but not much of a preacher. He was more of a teacher. Okay. And
there's a vast difference.
Yes, there is. Although some teachers do make good pulpit people, like Rubel Shelley. But he would say that he is first and foremost a teacher. So it's and through the Gospel Advocate after World War II. After the Civil War, I've gotten involved with World War II as my most recent research.
I wanted to ask you about that a little bit. Yeah.
But after the Civil War, Talbert Fanning turned the Gospel Advocate really over to him. And he and Aunt Mag put the Gospel Advocate out when there's no way it should have gone. And through his editorials and his writing and his influence, he became the dominant person in what would become Churches of Christ. So since Churches of Christ tended to move westward instead of eastward, because this was the movement of people, you know,
Sure.
was to the west, and especially the southwest into Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas and so forth. His influence went that direction as well, and the Advocate grew in that area. And so he became the dominant voice of Churches of Christ. And in fact, it was in 1906, the religious census people contacted Lipscomb about this group, you know, and he called them the Distinct People, which is the title of my book.
Yes. And you've also written a book on history of Churches of Christ.
Yes, that's Distinct People.
Okay.
That of the 20th century.
Right. And you're working on something now.
Well, I just had one published in May.
Tell me what that's about.
Well, again, it goes back to my going through the Gospel Advocate,
Okay.
you know, all those years, and I kept noticing, you know, especially after 1849, they began to talk about mission work within the Disciples movement, and there was the American Christian Missionary Society and this kind of thing, and Talbert Fanning and David Lipscomb were opposed to it because of some things in the Civil War and so forth. And then along the way there were Lipscomb and the Advocate supported people to go into the Indian Territory to preach, and see, well, that's kind of foreign missions, you know.
Yeah.
And there were two men, and then about 1890s, maybe late 1880s, John McGarvey at the College of the Bible in Lexington asked if the churches in Nashville would support a young man going back to his people over in what is now Turkey to preach. And the churches did, but it turned out to be that Lipscomb was the one that had to get up the support for him more than anything else. So this was the first foreign missions, but it was, you know, a native going home. But in 1892, a man from Hickman County, J.M. McCaleb, College of the Bible, wanted to go to Japan as a missionary. And this is going to be the first foreign missionary of Churches of Christ. And he and his wife went to Japan with a group in 1892 and started mission work among the Japanese. And then a few years later, of course there was another Nashville Bible School person who went before. So there's a real Tennessee connection with the mission work in Japan early on. And then, but the person that really caught my attention in doing my research was Saver Andrews. Now, you may have heard of Saver Andrews.
I'm not familiar.
Oh my, you need to know about Saver Andrews. She was a young woman from Dixon, Walnut Street Church in Dixon, who had, well, her mother really would tell her about J.M. McCaleb, about his work in Japan. And through that, she became interested in Japan and then met J.M. McCaleb. And by herself, she went to Japan. No, not another person went with her. A couple had planned to go, but they backed out for some reason, and she went by herself to Japan. And although back and forth several, because she was not a well person all of her life, she spent the rest of her life in Japan. Wow. And then stayed there during the war, which she was the only one of Churches of Christ who remained there all the time during the war. Almost died because she was under house arrest. And after the war, she came home for a while because of her health, but then she went back. And she died in Japan and is buried in Japan. Wow. It's a great story.
And her story is in your book?
Oh my, yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's a major part of the book.
Wonderful.
Now the book deals with Japanese mission work among the Japanese by missionaries of Churches of Christ from 1892 to 1970. And focus on World War II and go and flash back and tell the stories.
A lot A lot of stories, a lot of material.
Well, it was, and it's turned out to be a nice little book. It's about 300 pages long, and tell the story of, well, one of the stories that turned out to be probably one of the most important in all was a story of the Fox family, not the Foxes in Lewisburg, but the Foxes up in Kentucky. And two twin brothers went to Japan in 1920 and worked there. And one of their sons was Harry Robert Fox Jr. And Harry Robert Jr. will return to Japan as a missionary after the war, and will be one of the 5 or 6 persons, plus their wives, who were responsible for establishing Ibaraki Christian College. Wow. And had it not been for Harry Robert Jr., I could not have written the book as I did, because he gave me information that unavailable elsewhere.
That's great.
Yeah. So I'm real proud of the book. Abilene Christian Press.
PCU Press. Okay.
I published it back in May.
Well, I'll have to get a copy.
You need to.
Yeah, get you to sign it for me. I wanted to backtrack just a little bit. You mentioned your wife, and she had
okay. Okay. Virginia and I met of all places, we met in a history class.
At Lipscomb.
Under SC Boyce.
Okay.
Now, see,
perfect.
So that's perfect. It's
yeah.
perfect. And she was an elementary education major. And why she was taking the history class, I have no idea. But it turned out that it was a good thing that she did. She was a year ahead of me. She graduated in '53 and was already teaching school when I graduated in '54. But we were in the class under SC Boyce on Western American history, which, I enjoyed very much, and she did too. And so we got together and started dating and writing back and forth during the summer while I was out in Washington and she was here, and I still have those letters, both sides.
Okay.
And so, she was a tremendous lady. She was from East Nashville, went to Chapel Avenue Church at East High School, well, you knew her. She worked in the bookstore.
Probably. Yeah,
at the front desk.
Okay.
Yeah, she probably checked you out a number of times.
Well, I would recognize
because she worked there 25 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but then in 2000, when we have 3 children, Andy, Elaine, and Amy. Andy is one of the elders of the church at Woodmont.
Okay.
And where I served for 19 years. So son carrying on
there
for the father.
Great.
And Elaine married Jim Turner. You know that name?
Sounds familiar.
Well, he's older than you, but Jim Turner was from Russellville, Kentucky. He was a newspaper editor up there. She married him, and they have 3 children. Andy and Deb, who's a Lipscomb graduate. I think she was a year older than Andy. We married older women, And
runs in the family.
Yes, and so they have 2 daughters, Kate and Claire, and Kate has an adopted little boy named Will, and Claire has a new little girl named Ahsoka. Strange name, I think, but I think it comes out of Star Wars.
I wouldn't know.
But it also comes as a name from India too. Okay. And of course, Claire spent several of her mission trips to India, so that may have something to do with it. And then Elaine has 3 children, Clay and Lindsay and Trey. Only Clay is married, and he has a new baby girl, and so Mary Grace, and Amy is not married, and so we had a good family, and they all went to Lipscomb. Virginia was a Lipscomb graduate. I was a Lipscomb graduate. Andy and Elaine and Amy all Lipscomb graduates. So we spent
kept it in the family.
That's right, kept it in the family, and then Then in 2003, Virginia died of leukemia. So I was interested in what Harold was talking
Yes,
about.
absolutely.
Because, you know, now they might have been able to do something with it, but they just couldn't back then. And so she died of leukemia from May until September. It was diagnosed in May, she died in September.
Wow.
And I thought my life was over, you know?
Sure.
When you've been married 49 years to one woman and raised a family, you thought, well, where do we go from here? But you know the Lord is good. And this is, the Lord is good. And in 2004, my brother Jack and my sister-in-law Tootsie lived in Tyler, Texas, suggested that I needed to go with them to Edinburgh, Scotland, to the Pan-European lectures. Mm. And I decided, well, I may. Then I would back out, you know, because when your wife's been dead less than a year, you can't make any decisions.
Yes. They
tell you to wait a year before you make any decision of importance. And I thought, well, I don't know, but I did. I went. And while there, I met Bonnie Cone of Little Rock, Arkansas. Her husband had been dead since 2001. In fact, it was at breakfast where we first really met. And I told her, I said, Bonnie, said, Virginia, my wife, has been dead since 2003, and you just don't know where to go. And she said, I know how you feel. And nobody ever told me that. I know how you feel. And it's amazing how quickly then that we bonded. And we knew when we came back to the States that there was something there. And so that was 2004, and then we were married in June the 18th, 2005.
Well, indeed.
Yeah.
God is good.
She has a close Harding relationship. Her husband was on the board of Harding. He was in construction business in Little Rock, mm-hmm. and quite successful. And their son Jimmy has just sold the company, and he's on the board at Harding. So they have a real Harding connection.
Okay.
And yet, one of the things that pleased me, and of course, if you know Bonnie, you know that it shouldn't surprise you. The people at Lipscomb fell in love with her. They really, really do like her. And so she was amazed. But I said, well, and so one of my friends said, I told him about how that Bonnie felt, and she says, well, anybody would like Bonnie, you know. So anyway, so we've been married 12 years.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I have to ask one more question,
okay,
before we finish. In our social and political and cultural climate right now, 2017, you being a historian, I'd like to ask you about your thoughts about this debate about the Confederate monuments and statues.
Well, I think I understand a little bit where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, being a historian, I've tried to teach my students, you cannot put your stamp on people of the past, because I've had African American students, at least one, who want to argue about things. I said about Christians owning slaves. I said, well, we consider that to be totally wrong. But let's not put our stamp on those people, because you study history from the perspective of where people were then, and you don't come and take your values and determine the past. Now, that's how I feel about it. Some of the statues, if they were, they're more of a recent kind, probably need to be removed. If they've been there for a long, long time, probably not so. I don't know how long the Nathan Bedford Forrest bust has been in the Capitol building down here, but I don't think it's been there all that long. And if it's of recent vintage, maybe it should be removed.
Because maybe it was put up in response
Yeah,
to something.
yeah. So I think everything has to be taken in consideration from that perspective.
It's an interesting
Yeah.
perspective and
Yeah.
valuable one. I appreciate
Yeah,
your
yeah.
insight into
So, no, it's you just can't rewrite history because history has already been written. Now, interpreted, that's different. But to go and try to erase part of your history, you cannot do that because other countries have tried to do that. The Soviet Union, Germany, to rewrite history, and you can't do that. And of course, anytime that you get a totalitarian type of government, they're going to rewrite history according as they want it to read.
Sure.
And we live in a democracy, and we can't rewrite history like that.
Dr. Hooper, it has been a great pleasure
Yeah.
of mine to be
Yeah.
with you today.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for your service to Lipscomb University and for your service to the church over the years too.
Well, thank you.